Welcome to another episode of The Voice of the Church. My name is Bill Jong, and I'm a pastor at Blessings Christian Church in Hamilton, Ontario. And with me today, I have two distinguished guests. To my left, I have Bill Van Huisstede. This is his first time on the podcast. He was the founder and president of Fortress Equity Management, Inc. for a number of years. He's now retired, but he stays busy with a number of initiatives close to the kingdom of God. And Bill, we're super excited that you could join us for this particular episode. And then to my right, I have Jonathan Wellham, who is the president and CEO of Rocklink Investment Partners in Burlington. Jonathan has joined us already for a number of episodes, and Jonathan, we're glad you can be back for this one. Over the course of this episode and the next episode, we'll be talking about saving, investing, and giving, and it's just perfect that we have with us two individuals with expertise in this area. Now, Jonathan, we've had you here on Voice of the Church already. I'm wondering if you could begin just by telling us your story. So I know a little bit about the Wellham family. Two of Jonathan's brothers are involved in theological education. I believe every boy in your family, I don't know if there's a girl, had theological education. And maybe just share a little bit with us about how you got into investing and maybe even how your seminary education relates to your vocation.
Yeah. Well, I was privileged to be raised in a very strong Christian home where theology was core, so theological instruction in the church and so on. So that was an interest that was planted in us very early on, and that has an impact on the whole family. I loved business, I loved finance, I loved the stock market, and so I thought the direction would be into commerce. And so I went into McMaster and I did a commerce degree. But along the way, the Lord was prompting me with interest in theology, getting more involved in a local church and so on. And you're right, I have two brothers. Two of my three other brothers are involved in Christian ministry. And so my oldest brother had already done a degree at Ontario Theological Seminary, the old, that was the old Tyndale, many years ago, and he had started a church in Sarnia and was a pastor, and things were going along very well there, and I was, a tremendous model of Christian, a Christian example of a pastor. And then my younger brother, who probably had a larger influence on me, he was just passionate about Christian theology, philosophy, Christian worldview. He had, Francis Schaeffer was really his hero at the time, and so he was off to Trinity Evangelical Divinity School while I was doing my university studies here, and he wanted to be a professor. Once he became a Christian, he wanted to be a professor. So he headed off to Trinity, and he was working as MDiv, and then with a PhD in mind. He's down at the Southern Baptist Seminary now, Dr. Stephen Wellham. And he said, Jonathan, after I'd finished my business programs, he said, you're passionate about theology, you love studying worldviews, why don't you come down and spend a couple of years at the seminary while I'm here? And so I thought, well, that's a great idea, and things worked out for me to do that. So after my two business degrees and also a science degree, I went down and I finished an MA in Christian thought, theology, philosophy. Basically geared mostly on systematic theology, and that was really my strong interest. And so I studied that. I loved it. It was just a tremendous way to just cap off my education, because it really solidified my Christian theology, my understanding of the scriptures, its implications into all of life. And then I met up with Michael Lee Chin, who's become fairly well known in the investment business, and it was a very small little company. He loved my theological background. He said, why don't you come into the investment business? Doors didn't open up for ministry. So I said, okay, I'll go into the investment business. And it just took off from there. I think realistically, though, in terms of my experience, being a strong Christian and being well grounded in theology has been a tremendous plus in the investment business. First of all, just keeping you grounded and focused on what's important. We'll be talking about that this morning. But also for ministry. I've been able to lecture, teach in so many different settings that maybe a pastor wouldn't be able to go into. But because I'm an investment professional, I can get away with saying much more. Right. And so it's allowed a Christian witness and testimony that I'm very thankful to the Lord for, and for the opportunities I've been able to have to, again, tell the gospel and to express Christian truth into all of life, because all of life comes under the lordship of Christ. Yeah.
And I think that's so wonderful that you don't check your Christian faith at the door as an investor, but you go about your work as an investor, as a Christian, and you bring that to bear upon your work as an investor. Now, Bill, have you been a career financial management investor person as well, or did you come to this field late in the game in your life?
Yeah, I wouldn't call it late into the game. My first career actually was that of a tool and die maker.
Wow.
And I had many jobs before that, throughout high school, working at night, whether it's being janitor service or whatever the case may be, because I was always interested in being busy and starting to make some money. But after 6 or 7 years in the tool and die making trade, I decided to venture out into something different, and somehow I ended up in financial planning. And that's obviously where the Lord directed me. And I spent 35 years in the financial planning industry, and then I retired from it. And so, it's been the biggest part of my life. And the vast majority of the clients that I had were also Christian. And what was interesting is that there were many clients who also came to me, and after meeting me, decided that they wanted to become a client, and I would ask them why. And they were not Christian. But they said, because you are a Christian. And I was kind of taken back by that as to why would someone who is not a Christian then want to do business with somebody who is? And I think it's because the mindset is that if you're a Christian, I should be able to trust you. And I know that that's not always true.
Right.
Okay, but I really felt honored that they would think that way, but it also put an added amount of pressure on me to be diligent in what I was doing.
Yeah, I think that's really an amazing story. I have a friend who's a therapist, marriage and family therapist, and he often has unchurched, unbelieving people seeking him out precisely because he is a Christian.
Yeah.
And they know that Christians have a high view of marriage, that we should do all that we can to remain married, even when we enter into marital conflict. And so he is sought out. And so it's interesting to hear that there's a bit of an analogy when it comes to financial planning. Well, we've already begun to talk about what it means to be a Christian in this particular orbit. When it comes to saving in particular, what are some of the important biblical principles that we should be mindful of? I think, when I look at my sons, they begin to earn money and they see it as their money, right? It's hard earned. But it's not ultimately their money, is it? So, Jonathan, maybe we could begin with you and talk to us about this question: whose money is it that we have?
Well, that's obviously the most important question really at the outset. And from a Christian perspective, what the Bible makes clear is that all of the money is the Lord's. We ourselves are God's. We are His creation, and therefore everything that we have and are and ever will be is as a result of His grace and mercy to us. And so it starts from the premise that all of the money is the Lord's, and therefore that sets the tone on how we're going to approach investing and saving. That we, again, don't want to presume on God. We want to be thankful, and then we want to start to say, how can we be good stewards of this money, because this is ultimately God's, and we're going to be held accountable for how we have spent the money that God blesses us with.
Mm-hmm. And so, Bill, maybe you could chime in here. We need to be good stewards of the money God has given us. What are some ways in which money can be used that doesn't honor God, that isn't faithful? Is there something that might come to your mind in terms of a poor use of money?
Well, as I was listening to Jonathan talk, an old book came to mind. When I first went into the financial planning industry, there was a series of little booklets that were given to me, and the title was The Richest Man in Babylon. And these were books that were written a long time ago, but what it was entrepreneurship, basically. And in there, you learned the concept of, you should establish a budget. Okay, so in budgets is where we often go wrong. It's a misallocation of the resources that have been given to us. In this book, In the Richest Man in Babylon, the first thing was 10% of what you earn you should save. Well, that may be true, but what comes before that? And in our Christian walk, it's not the saving that is the priority, it's the giving, which we're going to talk about later, that is the priority. It's really using the resources to the honor and glory of God first. He asks us to give of our first fruits. So we're going to talk about that. And then after that, if there's money left over, then you can start thinking about saving. And then after that, you work out the rest of your budget. So you live off of what you have rather than saying, I want this, I'm going to borrow money, and we talked about that in a previous segment. I'm going to borrow money to buy the car that I want, or to buy the TV that I want. And I think that's where we start to run into problems already with the misallocation of capital. The desire to have a nice car is not wrong, but it's placing it as the priority that becomes wrong.
Well, Jonathan, I wonder if you could speak to this, because we live in a culture where credit cards are readily available, and so many of us have become impulse buyers. Speak to us about the importance of saving.
No, absolutely. I mean, in Paul in 1 Corinthians 16, he tells a very poor church that they should set aside money at the beginning of every week. And so, you know, from the script, right from the beginning of the Bible, from the Old Testament, the tithe, right to the New Testament, you've got this emphasis on saving, setting money aside in a disciplined way. Of course, that is to be used for the kingdom work, to pay and look after the church of Christ, but also for future needs and to be ahead of potential problems or issues that will arise that we don't know in God's providence that will come upon us. We need to be responsible for ourselves, our families, as leaders in the home and our family. So setting money aside and saving is a critical part of everyone's life. As Bill says, it's having a budget. You know, you can't really save, I think, effectively and efficiently if you don't have a budget and you know exactly where the money's coming in and where it's going to go. Because it's when you lay out a budget that you start to see where your priorities are. Are you actually putting the money into the areas you should, and so on. If you start from that premise, then I think it helps you control the debt problem, because it sort of lays out your priorities. And if you're going to go into debt, as we talked in an earlier program, debt should only be used to really buy a hard asset or something that's like a home or something where there's a tangible, real asset behind it. Where it's abused in our cultures is just, as you say, impulse buying. People don't have a budget. Greed or envy becomes the driving force. I have to have this when they don't have to have it at all. It's marketed to them, and they become overwhelmed with the desire. The desire in their heart becomes overwhelming, and then they go and buy it. But of course, the big thing with money is how do we control our heart's desires, and so that the money doesn't control us, and the money is a tool to be used in God's kingdom and also in our families and our church, and to advance things properly. So it's really about that balance, I think, laying things out, putting them all down on paper, knowing where your money's going, and being accountable to God and praying for wisdom. This is the other thing is, are you praying for wisdom? Are we looking to God to ask before we make major expenditure, should we be making that expenditure? Does that fit into His plan for our life and so forth? So we want to be directed by the Spirit and by God in all that we're doing.
I think that's a very helpful commentary. I find that people often have an intuitive sense of what their income is, and for the most part, they're not spending more than they earn. They get into trouble when they face a crisis, a big dental bill, a big car expense, and then that's when something goes on the credit card and debt begins to accumulate. What can you recommend, Bill, in terms of saving, and when in a person's life should he or she begin to save?
Well, the sooner the better. I think it's a good practice for parents to already begin teaching their children as soon as they get out to have part-time jobs, to take some of that money and say, we're going to put that aside. While the parent still has some level of control over that, it might be a good idea to do that, to teach them the concept already of putting money aside for a specific purpose in the future. I remember my mother having little pots that she put money into, and we started to teach our kids that as well from the beginning. So it doesn't matter where you save the money. In other words, should I start saving and putting it into stocks or into a mutual fund or whatever? That's not the most important decision. The most important decision is to actually do it. So if it goes into a bank account and you're earning a little bit of interest, almost no interest today, unfortunately, but it's just that discipline and habit of starting to put some money aside. And you'd be amazed over time what happens with that money. And I think that's the important.
And we want to teach setting aside money for savings, but also even as youngsters start to make some money, are they setting aside money for the church?
Absolutely.
That discipline, even if it could be very small amount in the scheme of things, but it's setting the mindset, the priorities, which is critical. Later on, I've seen it as I look after clients. We have about 150 families, and in that mix we have pastors, professors of theology and so forth that we look after the money. And people, they're not making a lot of money. You see people who don't make a lot of money, others who make large sums of money. And look, people that are disciplined, whether they're making a lot of money or not, can save. I've seen it. I've seen people who are sacrificial, they're missionaries in their saving. It's amazing what they can do. Other people make large sums of money and have virtually no discipline. So again, I think it's setting that the mindset. You want to honor God, give Him the priority, lay out a budget, and it's amazing what a small amount of money can do over time. And you don't have to be a high income earner to be able to save. I think that's a misnomer in our culture. I've seen it in action, and it's amazing to watch. It's really spiritually invigorating to see some of the people that I've watched over the years and how they save.
Mm-hmm. That's absolutely true. If I can just chime in for a moment on that. Looking at the clients that I had over the years, and I remember this one couple, they certainly weren't large income earners. I would say that they were the below average income earner. Now, he was a handyman, so anytime the car was broken, he knew how to fix it. So he went and fixed it himself. Even if it was minus 20 outside, he would still be out fixing the car rather than taking it to a mechanic. So he was resourceful in that sense. But even they were able to put away $500, $1,000 each year into a registered retirement savings plan, for example, to get a little bit of a tax break and to start saving for the future. How he managed to save that and pay for what we in our circles have as our private Christian schools always amazed me. But somehow they managed to do it, and that is by not having high expectations as to how well they should live.
Yeah. I think when we think of the love of money, which is something the Bible mentions in a couple of different places, we often think of people who spend. But how does the love of money apply to people who save? So in other words, money, you talked earlier about money controlling us and money functioning as an idol. Again, I think typically we make that association with consumerism. Mm-hmm. But how does that apply in some cases to those who are saving?
Yeah, it's interesting because you have the proverb that says, don't give me poverty or riches in between, so that I don't forget God and I see my daily dependence. I think the love of money and the preoccupation with money takes your eyes completely off God. It puts you on yourself. It puts your confidence in money and things, which is very transient. It can be here today and gone tomorrow, and it can it take over your life and your love of money, so that we become very, very greedy and self-centered, and you're just looking at your bank account and you don't care about other people. And so it'll demolish your life. You see people that are just given over to the love of money, and they are not happy people. And they can be quite wealthy. On the other hand, you can have people who want to have money but don't, and they become just entrenched in envy, and that can be a very bad thing also. So again, we want to be looking to the Lord. God puts everybody in different positions, this whole issue of God's providence and where He's placed us and being happy where God's placed us, and then going full force into what He has called us to do and leave the outcomes to Him. is so important, especially in our culture, which we see, we talked about this in early show, socialism, which is just driven by envy. I have to have what my neighbor has. It's not fair that they have it. Well, no, the focus is, on the Lord Jesus Christ. Seek ye first the kingdom of God and His righteousness. All these other things will be added unto you. And God will take care of us as we look to Him. And He'll do it in different ways, but He'll take care of us, sure. So just that love of money just eats at people. And I've seen it in the investment business. Where it's all about the bigger number. I've got to have more money at the end of the year. It's how can I increase my net worth? And it just drives them, but it ultimately destroys their life.
So I think we want to say, that saving is virtuous and a mark of responsibility, but it should not be all-consuming. We need to recognize that Christ is our ultimate King. He is the one we're serving, and even our saving needs to be subservient to the Lordship of Christ. Bill, you mentioned earlier saving. Is it best for us to put money in a place where we can't access it, so that we're not tempted when thinking of a nice vacation perhaps to go to that money? Or should our savings be accessible and liquid? How do we think about those options in terms of saving?
That's not always an easy question to answer, because
that's why I ask the experts.
Yeah. On one hand, you want to be discouraged in some way from accessing that money for frivolous reasons. But at the same time, you also need to have access to that money in case of emergencies. We talked about how people run into a bit of a crisis, the car breaks down, or they need dental work, and all of a sudden they need money. But if that money is put away in a place where you can't get at it, then you end up borrowing at excessively high interest rates, possibly. And then that begins to put other pressures on you. So I think in my mind, savings should always be accessible. But to be disciplined not to take it just for frivolous reasons.
Well, I wonder here if we're making a distinction then between saving and investing. I think Bill makes a good point. You almost want an emergency savings fund that you can access.
Well, we talk to clients, and Bill might have had a different time frame. We usually say try to keep, depending on their age and their flexibility, at least 4 months and up to 6 months of spending in what we call precautionary balances, so that it's liquid, it's there, it's for emergencies, won't put pressure and stress on the family, and so on. And so that's just part of financial planning, to have a bit of a resource there for.
And I think the logic there is, if the major breadwinner is unemployed for a number of months, you're still not going to go into debt necessarily. You've built up.
It allows you to make wiser decisions, because you have that fallback, if you will, rather than just hit the panic button because you don't know where the food's going to come next week. You can't even go to Fortino's or to the shopping center and buy the food. I mean, that's being reckless, I think, especially when people can plan ahead.
What options do people have in terms of saving opportunities? So, I mean, you think of a savings account at a bank, whereas Bill mentioned you don't really gain a lot of interest. Are there other options available to us where it is still liquid and accessible, but we could perhaps be earning a little higher interest rate?
Absolutely. And the way someone in general should look at their investments as they save, and then that becomes a larger sum, they should start looking at what monies might I need in the next 6 months, say. What monies do I need maybe a year or two out, and those monies that look like they're beyond 3, 4, 5 years, like they're longer term. Then you pick your assets or your investment based upon your time horizon. So that if you might need the money in 3 months, you want to have it very liquid. It's going to be, unfortunately, probably in a savings type of vehicle, GIC, investment savings account at a bank. Yeah, you'll make almost no interest, but it's there. It's predictable. The further out you go in time, the more you can look at things like bonds, preferred shares, stocks, which will be more volatile, but certainly will give you higher dividend income and larger capital growth. So it's very important. In our business, they call it asset allocation. That as you start to invest, you diversify reasonably well, and you also do asset allocation. I mean, those are both principles that the Bible speaks about in Proverbs, Ecclesiastes. casting your bread upon the water and looking at 7 and 8 different opportunities, so that you're not just concentrating in one thing and taking too much risk. So those are important sort of investment principles, if you will.
Yeah. Bill, did you want to chime in on that at all, or?
He stole what I was going to say.
Oh, I see.
I was
see.
going to bring
yeah,
Proverbs into it.
Okay. Okay. Excellent.
Yeah, the
excellent.
one thing I'd point out is a lot of times Christians will come and they say, should I be investing at all or saving? I mean, maybe they have a bit of a reserve, but God could, the Lord could return tomorrow, and why should I be saving? And I think step back one second. We know why we should save individually, be responsible to look after a family, set aside money, and very importantly for the church and for the message of the gospel, so that we can continue to evangelize and the gospel goes out. But also in a bigger picture, when we save, when we're net savers, like Canadians are net savers, that provides capital for our companies, our corporations, our industry. If we didn't have any net savings, we wouldn't have the money to develop our resources in Canada, which has been a problem historically, because we've had to bring foreign money, Chinese money, or money from the States to develop our resources, because we're not saving enough. So saving is very important if we want to see economic growth. If we want to see economic growth in productivity, we need to invest in capital. Corporations can't invest in capital if we as households aren't saving. And so these are all inextricably linked. And we need to understand better how the economy works. So that, we have a prime minister, for example, Justin Trudeau, who says, he thinks that he doesn't like the fact that our TFSAs, our tax-free savings accounts, benefit, he says, just the wealthy. Well, that's not true. But the point of the tax-free savings account is, how do we get Canadians to save more so they're not dependent on government largesse, and that money goes into the corporate sector for economic growth, which provides jobs for everybody. And so we're looking at savings and looking at it from a Christian perspective in our own families, but from a whole country perspective, from a whole economy perspective. If you don't have net savers, you're going to have economic disaster. You cannot develop an economy without net savers. So who should be doing the savings? Well, Christians should be good savers and making sure it goes into the right companies, the right areas, that we're allocating capital into ethical, moral businesses. And we can make a big difference in terms of the economy if we're savers.
I guess if you take that to the next level, we're going to talk about investing as we go along more and more. Without that savings, as you're pointing out, it's difficult to get capital. But on the other side as well, as we continue to borrow more instead of saving more, doesn't that create a potential house of cards, right? That if you don't have cash, if you don't have assets that are liquid for investment in providing capital for infrastructure, let's say,
yes,
building highways, building electrical grids, and
yes,
all those sorts of things, but you have a lot of debt, and all of a sudden you find you can't pay that debt, that has some pretty serious implications for investing as well, isn't that right?
No, that's the case. We now live in an economic country, but I think that most of the world now that it's more debt-based. And so if you don't have sufficient collateral to support the debt, it makes the whole economy vulnerable, as you say, a house of cards eventually, if the debt grows much faster than your collateral because you're not saving. So it's not just a abstract topic. It's really important to us as individuals, to us as Christians, Christian families, our churches, and also our overall economy, being responsible in the country that we live in. I mean, it has far-reaching implications that I don't think a lot of times people think about. If you like flying on that plane, that's because someone saved a lot of money and put it into, they thought long-term. We have trains because they were disciplined people that set aside money. Everything we have and enjoy in terms of our technology was because we had savers somewhere along the line who put money aside. And I think that's honoring to God. It's part of our Dominion mandate to work the resources and what God has given us. Now we have this coronavirus. Well, we'll be very happy if some of our healthcare businesses have savings and extra money they can invest in a vaccine or some treatment, right?
It's a very interesting point. I think you're right. I don't think we typically conceive of saving in terms of contributing to the well-being of an economy as a whole. But you're saying that saving it is never just for oneself. There's the love of neighbor that's embedded into saving, and the love of one's country even, which is very, very fascinating. You know, in recent decades, the credit card was introduced on the scene, and that has played a part in frivolous spending and people incurring debt. Do you have a position on the use of a credit card? Sometimes I hear Christians say we should cut up our credit cards and just use cash. What commentary do you have on the use of credit cards?
I would take it back to the individual. I mean, I have a credit card. I have a credit card for a business. I have a credit card for myself personally. I think once I've paid interest on that credit card in my, you know, I'm 58, so I haven't had a credit card all my years. But since I've had a credit card, I've paid 1 month, and that's because the bill got lost somewhere, and you know, I missed it somewhere. And so, to the extent that it's a wonderful payment system, it's very efficient, very effective. You don't have to walk around with cash, and the way our society is going anyway, cashless will be here in no time. It's almost here now. So I think a credit card is a great tool. The issue will become, can you handle it? So I think there are those people where the temptation is just too large, and in that case, they need to come up with a debit card, or you know, don't have access to the credit for their own discipline. But for the rest of us, I would say, to be racking up interest charges on a credit card outside of a real emergency. I mean, and there are emergencies that come up, and then having a really quick way to pay it down, or at least borrow, you know, maybe a line of credit on the house, which is a lower interest rate, so you don't have to run up your credit card. Outside of those very few circumstances, there's no reason you should be paying interest on a credit card. And I think that's, we certainly tell our clients that, and our clients are quite disciplined. Most of them are Christians and don't have an issue. But there are those people with the issue. I think for them, they shouldn't have a credit card. They should just say, no, I'm just going to have a debit card, so the money has to be there. And you can't step out from having, I mean, you can't just walk around with cash anymore, but there's ways where you can, you know, get a debit card or just have access. And so that's the way I would approach it. It depends on the individual, their heart, their self-control. That would.
Bill, if assuming somebody is responsible and pays off the credit card bill monthly, are there ways in which we can use credit cards to our advantage?
That's a. You stumped me on that question.
Well,
So
I'm just thinking. I think of building up a credit rating, for instance, which I wonder even in terms of. I think you can use the assets of a credit card without paying interest on them for 30 days. So
sure.
in a sense, you have an advantage there as well.
Yeah, I was thinking more along the line of the question of being how to use it for spending purposes.
Or if there's a sale, sometimes you're walking along, you go, man, wow, it's 60-70% off. I'm looking at, I need that. I'm going to be buying that anyway in the future. You don't have the cash. Out goes the credit card, but you can pay it at the end of the month. So I think the flexibility of a card can be quite powerful. The credit rating is also very interesting. In our society, there's no question that you want to make sure that you have a good credit rating to keep all of your costs down, especially young people. They might, I mean, I have 3 kids that are in their 20s. They all have credit cards, and they're very careful with them, but they're trying to establish a credit rating. So when they settle down, they go to get a mortgage, they have a credit rating. So I think
we had this with one of our sons who did not have a credit card, did not have any debt, but he could not obtain a loan because he had no credit rating. So it's interesting how that works.
That's sort of counterintuitive, but if you think it from the bank's perspective, they want to see a track record.
Absolutely, absolutely. That does make sense. All right, we've had this wonderful discussion. I wonder if we could wrap up this episode by having us reflect on the idea of contentment. You know, the Apostle Paul says to Timothy that with food and clothing, we should be content. Well, if I look at people across the globe, even in those impoverished countries, they still often have food and clothing. And that's almost the starting point for everybody in the world today. How do we understand, that summons to biblical contentment with the fact that we all have so much more than food and clothing, and we often experience a craving for something more? And are we violating the biblical summons to contentment by having some things that are nice and go beyond the realm of mere necessity. Jonathan, if you could comment, and then I'll go to you, Bill, as well.
Yeah, I'm not sure I could identify with when the apostle. I mean, we understand the theology of it, but the Apostle Paul, of course, when he makes those comments and statements, they're awesome, right? They're just unbelievable. You see, which I think gets to the heart of the issue. I think the only way he could ever say that is because of his relationship with God through Christ and the indwelling of the Holy Spirit. So, I think the first place for contentment is to have a strong Christian life, to be, we're joined with Christ, and to have that communion with the Lord on a daily basis, and to be in the Word, and to have the strongest spiritual relationship we can with God, number one. I mean, that's going to anchor our contentment in all situations. I mean, that's what you see with the Apostle Paul. I mean, how could you be in worse situations than he, and treated more poorly than the Apostle Paul, and yet he makes that statement, and we know that is 100% true. So I think the spiritual vitality, spiritual relationship with God is absolutely essential. I don't think it's, and then you ask the question, how far does that go in terms of your spending? I think, being in the business for many years, I do think that that's between the Christian and God to a certain degree too. It's easy for people, I mean, there's obvious abuses, but in a lot of cases, leave that between the individual and God.
It's almost impossible to establish rules there in any case,
it's very
right?
difficult. So, it's very difficult, yeah.
Bill, do you have any commentary on that as well?
Throughout the history of Israel, one interesting thing that I've noticed, that I'm sure that you have as well, that when Israel was blessed by the Lord, they wandered away from the Lord. When that happened, the Lord then had to take it away from them in order for them to once again rely on Him. So Paul's contentment was that his dependence on God, he's learned, and in Philippians he says, I have learned to be content. It's not something that comes natural to us. Over time, if you're focused on your relationship with the Lord Jesus Christ, then for sure you learn to be content eventually. And I'm reminded of the people that I work with in the Dominican Republic. There you have people that, in our opinion, are living in abject poverty. They have dirt floors. When it rains, their hut fills with water, and they get up in the morning and they're stepping in the muddy water. But you would never know from these people that they are unhappy. They don't feel that they're lacking in things. They feel they're lacking in opportunity. Poverty comes in so many different ways. As we think of it as physical poverty here. But there's also spiritual and emotional poverty, and what the Apostle Paul is talking about is that he doesn't lack those things because his dependence is on the Lord. So when it comes to investing, saving, we're going to talk about giving, is learning to be content with what the Lord has provided and continue to strive always in hope that the Lord will continue to bless you with your daily needs.
Those are such wonderful words. I think it's so important for us at times to imagine what life would be like if we were stripped of all of our possessions, and if all we had was food and clothing. Could we still be happy? Yeah. And there the crucial issue is, as both of you have mentioned, a right relationship with the Lord, and understanding that in Christ we are rich, even though we might not have much.
Right.
Well, this has been another wonderful discussion for us about saving and spending, and how the Bible relates to these particular topics. We're going to be back with another episode in the future to discuss this in relation to giving. Thanks for joining us.